From a cannibalistic fantasy killer to a man who calmly whispered peace to everyone, Oklahoma's death chamber saw 5 executions in just 2 years. These stories reveal the shocking crimes, haunting last meals, and the final words that echo long after the needle was pushed. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. That way you won't miss any new stories about last meals, final words, and the chilling history of executions in the United States. Wendell Arden Grissom. The story of Wendell Arden Grissom begins in Blaine County, Oklahoma, where he grew up in the small community of Watauga. Like many who later end up on death row, Grissom's early life was marked by instability. By his 20s, drugs and alcohol had taken hold of him, and his behavior spiraled into violence. On a November night in 2005, Grissom made a choice that would forever change lives. Armed with a rifle, he broke into the Watauga home of 23-year-old Amber Matthews. Amber, a young woman known for her kindness and bright spirit, had been visiting with her friend, Dro Kopf. Without warning, Grissom opened fire. Amber was struck multiple times, her life cut short inside her own home. Dro Kopf, though shot as well, survived the attack and later testified about the horror of that night. The crime shocked Watauga. This was not the act of a man caught in the heat of an argument. It was a deliberate home invasion, a violent assault on 2 innocent people. Prosecutors painted Grissom as a dangerous man who showed no regard for life, while his defense pointed to his intoxication and history of substance abuse. But in 2007, a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. For nearly 2 decades, Grissom sat on Oklahoma's death row at the state penitentiary in McAllister. During appeals, his lawyers argued that drugs and alcohol had clouded his judgment the night of the crime. But Amber's family, who had waited 20 years for justice, insisted the punishment was deserved. On March 20, 2025, the state carried out his execution by lethal injection. There was no special meal request. He received the standard prison tray. Witnesses described him as calm as he lay strapped to the gurney. In his final moments, he turned toward Amber's family and admitted the truth he had long denied, that his actions were fueled by intoxication. His final words were an apology, asking for forgiveness, saying, "I was drunk, I was high, I was out of my mind." The chemicals began to flow, and within minutes, Wendell Arden Grissom was pronounced dead. For Amber's family, it marked the end of a painful chapter, but the memory of a young woman's stolen life will always overshadow the final words of the man who took it. George John Hansen. The case of George John Hansen stretches back to the late 1990s, when Tulsa County was shaken by a crime that seemed almost senseless in its cruelty. On August 28, 1999, 77-year-old Mary Bowles had just left church and was driving home when Hansen and his accomplice, Victor Miller, spotted her. They decided to carjack the elderly woman. What followed was a brutal kidnapping. Hansen and Miller forced Mary into her own vehicle and drove her to a remote location. There she was beaten and murdered. Her body was later found abandoned. The life of a kind and elderly woman taken for nothing more than a stolen car. But the violence didn't stop there. Victor Miller, Hansen's partner in the crime, later killed a man named Gerald Thurman, a good Samaritan who had tried to intervene. The case horrified the community. 2 innocent lives ended in one night, linked to the reckless actions of men who treated human life as disposable. Hansen was captured and brought to trial in Tulsa County. Prosecutors described him as cold and calculating, while the defense raised arguments about his troubled past. The jury was not swayed. He was convicted of kidnapping and murder, and by the early 2000s, he was sentenced to death. For years, Hansen sat on death row as appeals moved through state and federal courts. His case gained attention again in 2021, when he was transferred from federal to state custody under a rare order that fast-tracked his execution. Still, the years passed until finally, in 2025, his date with the death chamber arrived. On June 12, 2025, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister, Hansen was led into the execution chamber. He had not requested a special last meal. Instead, he was given the standard tray: chicken pot pie, dinner rolls, fruit cup, and carrots. As the 3-drug lethal injection protocol began, witnesses described him as calm, almost resigned. When asked for his final statement, Hansen did not launch into apologies or long explanations. Instead, he spoke just 3 quiet words: peace to everyone. Moments later, his breathing slowed, and at 10:19 a.m., he was pronounced dead. For the Bowles family, the execution closed a chapter that had remained open for more than 2 decades. But the memory of a gentle woman kidnapped and murdered on a Saturday morning in Tulsa County will forever mark Hansen's place in Oklahoma's long and painful history of capital punishment. Michael Dwayne Smith. In the early 2000s, Oklahoma City was shaken by a string of shootings that would later be tied to a man known on the streets as the Hoover Killer. His real name was Michael Dwayne Smith. On February 22, 2002, Smith set out on a violent spree. Prosecutors would later say he was looking to prove himself to gang members. That night, he gunned down 41-year-old Janet Moore as she sat in her home, and later the same evening, he fatally shot 22-year-old Sarath Puluru outside a convenience store. Several others were injured in the shootings, acts of violence that seemed as sudden as they were cold-blooded. Witnesses identified Smith, and police quickly tied him to the crimes. By 2004, he stood trial for 2 counts of first-degree murder. The case painted him as a young man who had chosen a path of gangs and guns, leaving 2 innocent families forever scarred. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. For more than 20 years, Smith sat on Oklahoma's death row, his appeals winding slowly through the courts. Along the way, he insisted that mental illness and heavy drug use played a role in his actions, but the courts ultimately upheld the sentence. On April 4, 2024, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, the state carried out his execution by lethal injection. Unlike many condemned inmates, Smith declined a special last meal, accepting only what the prison offered that day. When asked for final words, he gave none. His response was brief, almost dismissive. "Nah, I'm good." Witnesses said his voice carried no remorse, no apology, and no explanation. Just a flat refusal to speak in his last moments. Minutes later, the lethal drug slowed his breathing, and at 10:16 a.m., he was pronounced dead. For the families of Janet Moore and Sarath Puluru, it was the end of a 22-year wait for justice. For Oklahoma, it was the first execution of 2024, and a reminder of a night in 2002 when a young man's choices left a permanent scar on the city. Richard Norman Rojam Jr. Some cases linger for decades, their shadows stretching across generations. The story of Richard Norman Rojam Jr. is one of those painful chapters in Oklahoma's history. It began in 1984 in Custer County. 7-year-old Layla Cummings was a bright child with her whole future ahead of her. That future was stolen when Rojam, her stepfather, took her life in an act of violence that shocked the entire state. Investigators quickly identified him as the prime suspect. The evidence presented in court left little doubt, and in 1985, he was convicted of first-degree murder. Rojam was sentenced to death, but what followed was an extraordinary legal odyssey. For nearly 40 years, his case moved through endless appeals and retrials, becoming one of the longest-running capital cases in Oklahoma's history. By 2024, the appeals had run their course and the sentence was set to be carried out. On June 27, 2024, inside the Oklahoma State Penitentiary at McAlester, Rojam was served his last meal. Unlike some inmates who keep it simple, he ordered a Little Caesars pizza with pepperoni and extra cheese, a bottle of ginger ale, multiple packets of condiments, and 2 vanilla ice cream cups. When asked for his final words, Rojam offered none of the remorse or explanations that some inmates attempt. Instead, his statement was short and flat. I've said my goodbyes." At 10:21 a.m., the 3-drug lethal injection protocol was carried out. Within minutes, Richard Norman Rojam Jr. was pronounced dead. For Layla's family, it marked the end of a nearly 4-decade wait for justice. For Oklahoma, it closed one of the state's longest and most painful death penalty cases, an execution that came long after the crime had first shaken the community. Kevin Ray Underwood. The story of Kevin Ray Underwood is one of the darkest chapters in Oklahoma's history, a case so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggle to process the details. In April 2006, the quiet town of Purcell was shaken when 10-year-old Jamie Rose Boland went missing. Jamie was a cheerful little girl, known in her neighborhood for her kindness and energy. She disappeared after walking home from the local library, and a frantic search ensued. Authorities soon zeroed in on Underwood, a 26-year-old neighbor who lived just a few doors down from Jamie. Outwardly, he appeared unremarkable, a soft-spoken man who worked at a fast food restaurant. But when detectives questioned him, cracks began to show. Eventually, he confessed to something almost unthinkable. Underwood lured Jamie into his apartment with the promise of watching cartoons. Once inside, he struck her with a cutting board, suffocated her, and carried out acts rooted in a cannibalistic fantasy he had long harbored. The crime was premeditated. Police later discovered chilling evidence in his home, including duct tape, barbecue skewers, and a written plan outlining his intent. Jamie's body was found hidden in a plastic tub inside his apartment closet. The community was horrified. Prosecutors described Underwood as a predator who had plotted for months to fulfill his fantasies. His defense attorneys did not deny the crime, but pointed to his severe mental illness and disturbed obsessions. Despite these arguments, in 2008, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. For nearly 2 decades, Underwood sat on Oklahoma's death row, his case winding through appeals. Many wondered whether the state would ever carry out his sentence, but in 2024, his execution date was set. On December 19, 2024, his 45th birthday, and just 6 days before Christmas, Kevin Ray Underwood was led into the death chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. His last meal was indulgent: chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes with gravy, a cheeseburger with fries, pinto beans, a hot roll, and a cola. When asked for his final words, he apologized, acknowledging the terrible pain he had caused. But he also added a note of bitterness, saying, "The decision to execute me on my birthday and 6 days before Christmas was a needlessly cruel thing to do to my family." At 10:19 a.m., the lethal drugs flowed, and within minutes, Underwood was pronounced dead. For Jamie's family, the execution brought a measure of justice, though no punishment could ever erase the horror of what happened to their little girl. Kevin Ray Underwood's case remains a chilling reminder of how hidden darkness can fester behind ordinary doors, and how one man's twisted fantasy ended the life of a child and scarred an entire community. In just 2 years, Oklahoma executed 5 men. All were put to death by lethal injection, even though the state authorizes other methods like nitrogen hypoxia, electrocution, and the firing squad. The crimes were brutal. The last meals varied, and the final words left behind a chilling mix of remorse, defiance, and quiet resignation. If you found these stories thought-provoking, hit that like button and subscribe for more chilling true crime content. Drop a comment, which of these cases struck you the most? Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more true crime investigations into last meals, final words, and the haunting legacy of America's executions.